As Ukraine prepares for another wave of Russian attacks on the Eastern Front, an EU-Ukraine summit takes place. But is there the courage and determination in Europe to stay the course and persevere until Russia is comprehensively defeated? What will that take? And how will Russia try to fight back with terroristic threats, influence, coercion, and disinformation? What cards has Putin got left to play? Welcome to Silicon Curtain Podcast. If you enjoy the material we create, then please do like and subscribe to help boost the popularity of our videos in YouTube. Aliona Hlivco is a former Ukrainian MP. She is a regular contributor to the Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House, as well as Monocle 24, CapX, and is a TEDx speaker. She is also a guest lecturer and senior consultant at Atticus Partners. Well, Aliona, I hope I got that all correct. I don't know if you have anything to add to the biography.
No, I think that sums it up, basically. I'm happy to elaborate more on my background in Ukraine and what exactly I'm doing in London, but that sums it up, yes.
Well, I think that's probably a good place to start, because I think the political aspect, the fact that you have been very much involved in Ukrainian politics and know the workings of that system, and in fact, what we know from the interviews, and many of my audience will have come to appreciate, is there's been a huge evolution of civil society, political sophistication, and of course, multiple revolutions in Ukraine. So I'd love to know a bit about your political background and where that fits in with this, extraordinary set of changes over the last decade or so.
So I started in politics in Ukraine quite young. I was 17 years old and a first-year student of political science in my hometown university called Chernihiv National University. And because I decided to study political science in 2004, coincidentally, that's when the first revolution in Ukraine broke out. And 1 month into my education, where I just started learning what politics is about and how it's conducted in the world. We were basically led onto the streets with other students and professors and lecturers to see what was happening in Ukraine. And in that time, that was the biggest social protest that we have witnessed, first of all, but that independent Ukraine has witnessed itself. Obviously, there were some protests and movements in the 90s, but they were not all-encompassing. They didn't include all the regions, the whole country, and you didn't see hundreds and thousands of people on the streets. So it was quite fascinating in its own way, and we were encouraged to go out and see what's happening as political science students, just for our own kind of scientific, empirical research and knowledge for the future, to see how the revolutions are being conducted, how the leaders go about directing people into the right direction, how they craft their message, how they deliver it, how the masses act, how they respond, and where it's going. So for us, it was more of an educational experience, but at the end of the day, being quite active. And I was convinced by the need of change in the country, having grown up in the 90s, where Ukraine was transforming from the authoritarian into a democratic state. You would grow up seeing oligarchs and many businessmen taking over various industries, controlling politicians, controlling government policies, and people living in scarcity and poverty. I think I was quite convinced by the ideas of the revolution. And then eventually, when it came to the point of being offered a volunteering role by one of the political parties, I've agreed to go be an observer at the Electoral Commission, and then start working for them purely on volunteer basis, doing media, some press releases, later on becoming a press officer. So I think that's where it started for me. And they never let go of me since. I've been in Ukrainian politics since then for 13 years, and went all the way up from, the press officer, student union of the political party, all the way to chairing the regional party organization, running for the parliament, regional parliament, being an advisor to the chairman of the regional government, and eventually the prime minister herself, because the leader of our political party was prime minister twice, the one who was detained as well and had political prosecutions against her. So it was a very...
Tymoshenko, is it?
Yes, correct. That was Yulia Tymoshenko. So it was quite a turbulent time in politics, and I've spent all of my 20s there, and once it picks you up, it never lets you go. So that was quite an interesting time for me.
And of course, it seems to be a formative period for many people. And, one of the observations I've had through these interviews is, first of all, how young so many people who are now incredibly active are, whether that's in journalistic circles, politics, and especially, civil society. We take the example of Alexander Matviechuk, who won the Nobel Prize. Again, a range of extraordinarily, well, to my eyes, youthful people. I'm getting on a little bit already. But also how many strong female characters. Now, I know in wartime it's a little bit biased because many of the men are away at the front, whether that be, writers, politicians, etc. There are many people who are actually serving. But it does seem that the role of women has been extraordinarily important in those revolutions. And really that sort of, culminated in the Revolution of Dignity, which has an extraordinarily pivotal moment.
Yes, first of all, Ukrainian politics were full of young people, because I think, again, driven by the two revolutions in 2004 and then 2014, the Revolution of Dignity that you mentioned, there was a strong need and an ask within the society to get rid of all old, corrupt, post-Soviet politicians who were communists to begin with, that then repainted themselves into new political colors and became social democrats, became liberals, pure Democrats, conservatives. I think in Ukraine, during the 90s and 2000s, we've encountered some like 200 political parties that were officially registered. Of those 200, even over 200, I believe about 60 were actually active. Some of them were small, some of them were bigger. The political party that I ended up working for, obviously, it ended up being the biggest political party in Ukraine, with all regional party organizations, the district ones, the village ones. So it was a very well-structured organization. But others would only have a name and maybe 2-3 people to them. Mostly kind of reused and recycled by many oligarchs, where they would just change the name, slap a new public face onto it and go ahead, off you go into the parliament to lobby my interests. So I think because of that, people really wanted to change the generation, and there was a big hope that the young people who would end up living in the country would do a better job in trying to run it, because they would be creating a future for themselves and their children, not selfishly try to, steal as much as possible, as the old generation did. So there was a push for young people, and because society wanted that, naturally all political parties tried to recruit young, active people. One of whom was I. And I met, as you rightly say, a lot of bright young people, Western educated or educated in Ukraine, that had new views on how to build the country, that had all sorts of exchange programs and internships, similarly to me as well. That definitely gives you an inspiration on what to do with your country when you see how other countries do it successfully, because also having grown up behind the Iron Curtain, you kind of lose that prospect, and you need to go out and see and learn. And I've met many brave young women like myself along the way too. I think generally there is a political culture and a tradition within the Ukrainian society that women were always quite strong. Despite the general belief, I think that maybe Eastern European societies are somewhat a bit more conservative, and maybe a role of a woman is somewhat subsided. I would say that it's the opposite to that. I often found it even strange when I moved to London, for example, or when I went to study in the US, that women have to fight for their rights. They have to fight for their voice to be heard, for their political engagement and participation, or leading in businesses, being the the head of the family almost. Because in Ukraine, it all kind of comes naturally. I grew up in a family where roles were always very equal. If anything, even going back to my great-grandmother, she was a great entrepreneur. She had her own business. Even in Soviet Union, she would grow and sell flowers, but eventually ended up being almost like a farmer, who would make most of her profit off of that. And then my grandmother ended up being in civil service. She was the first woman in her village to have a higher education degree in history. And similarly, my mother went on to get a profession. So I grew up with being completely oblivious to the fact that women cannot hold their own and be as active and successful as men. And I think that's the case for most women in Ukraine. We are quite proactive, sometimes strong-headed, sometimes stubborn, which I hear quite often from many friends and colleagues even.
That's a word I've heard a couple of times in interviews.
There you go.
Yeah.
There you go. So I think maybe that's a strong combination. And that's something that we definitely need, especially in developing, evolving Ukraine, that's now becoming, an equal member to the Western community. I wouldn't even say just EU, but the whole civilized world. Something that we definitely need.
There's another characteristic which, there's two questions I think that emerge. I mean, one is coming back to the patchwork of political parties that you mentioned. Other speakers I've spoken to have also said that this is reflected also in the media environment. You had a lot of independent media that burst through during the various revolutions, but you also had a lot of media holdings that were controlled or influenced by oligarchs. And until recently, have very much been used again as a kind of tool for lobbying, individual financial interests. Let's tackle that one and whether that situation has now decisively changed with the war. And then we'll go back to, Ukrainian characteristics, which I think is a fascinating topic.
Oligarchy was always something that Ukraine suffered from the most. And oligarchy, by definition, from the political science, is the power of the few. But in Ukraine, the distinctive features, and I think in the modern world generally, it's usually a businessman who owns various businesses in many industries, who also leverage some level of political influence, and at the same time own media, and through that media they can influence both the society and the political realm. So in Ukraine that was quite prevalent because, again, we need to go back mentally into the 90s, which were quite brutal and harsh in all of the post-Soviet space. Ukraine and Russia specifically. The country was suffering from racketeering at the time when most of state-owned enterprises were getting privatized. And when, the liberal market was finally upon us and we were trying to implement those rules in our country to start new businesses, small and medium-sized ones, you would always have some sort of criminal groups trying to come and take over them. Eventually, I think that grew and that elevated from small and medium businesses to big businesses too. When all of a sudden one big businessman would own the biggest metal works in steel works, or any sort of like oil company, any big enterprise in the country, and then another one would come in and think, well, why didn't I get that? Why didn't I get to privatize it for nothing and then make huge amounts of income? And that only costs a little bit because the tender procedures were quite corrupt. So they were able to get that quite cheaply and then make loads of profits. And you only have so many of those enterprises in Ukraine. I mean, the resources they're quite big, but they're not unlimited. So the situation elevated to state level fights for those big enterprises. Correspondingly, whoever has more political influence has more leverage on the decision making and perhaps can take over that, businesses as well as political parties. So through those means, those businessmen started growing, trying to influence the political decisions, trying to create small political parties that I've earlier discussed, control factions in the parliament, influence certain decisions being made. And they've eventually realized that in order to do that, and you know, it's classic strategic communications campaign, that they would take over legally. There needed to be a legal campaign, they needed to be a political campaign, but they realized that they need a media campaign too, because when you operate on a state level, you also need to transmit a certain message that will help you secure your positions, whether be it to then pressure the politicians from the opposite side to subside and to give into whatever you're trying to achieve. And then to control the narrative in the society, so that society maybe doesn't know too much, or take your point of view, that they view those processes and things, or you taking over a certain plant as a normal thing. So eventually they started going after media too. And that's how these oligarchs started emerging in Ukrainian society. And we grew to seeing maybe up to, I would say, up to 10 most prominent ones, maybe 4 to 5, the ones that are quite well known in the West now. They were quite powerful in Ukraine for quite some time. Up until recently, I would say that the real battle against the oligarchs only started with President Zelensky, because I don't know if you were following the developments. Every incoming president tried to control them and to make them work for Ukraine, but also for him. So be useful for everyone, kind of not to threaten that status quo of every single businessman, just not to trigger another redivision and reappropriation of wealth in the country, which we were witnessing throughout the 90s. So every president kind of approached that very carefully, and also, of course, needed to kind of abide by the rules of the oligarch who put him in power.
I was about to say exactly that. You know, they would potentially touch other oligarchs, but they couldn't touch the one who would help them to ascend to the golden throne, as it were.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's why the events of the last 2 weeks are extraordinary. I mean, not just that they're happening in wartime, but it seems that that struggle against corruption is ongoing. It seems that the evolution of civil society has actually accelerated during wartime, not decelerated. Again, an absolutely extraordinary process, and it's being reported on relatively openly. If you compare that to the Second World War and the extremely tight media environment that existed in Britain at that time, you would not have had, these kind of processes and changes being aired at all. Which isn't to say, there was huge corruption. There probably wasn't, but there were many things that were covered up in the Second World War by the British government. But it seems that in the last week or so, there has been this extraordinary campaign, not just against sort of broad set of oligarchs, but even against the oligarch who supposedly helped Zelensky into power, and some ex-ministers as well. This is more than just settling of scores, isn't it? This does look like a comprehensive attempt to try to tackle that deep level long-term corruption.
Absolutely. And I would start by saying that the war is probably the time that's most conducive to corruption in general, because, when the country is mobilized and only consolidatively looking into one direction of fighting off the enemy, functioning under the martial law, which is absolutely restricting and doesn't really leave you with all the mechanisms for checks and balances in the country that are normally there during the peaceful times in a normal democracy. It definitely helps corruption go unnoticed more. And that's the case not just for Ukraine as a developing democracy, that's also the case for any country that's at war. Many who are peaceful nations these days, even in the West, are quite guilty of that too, as we could see. But going back to the fight on oligarchs in Ukraine, that process has actually started 2 years ago. It started when Zelensky first came into power. And he noted that as one of his main objectives, actually, to get rid of oligarchs and to turn oligarchs of Ukraine into big businessmen, as they normally would be in the rest of the world. You can be a tycoon, you can be a millionaire, a billionaire, but you can't be an oligarch. You have to play by the rules. You have to give up what's maybe not yours or wasn't gained by legal means. And you certainly need to give up on any attempts of exuding political influence in the country, be it through media or political contacts or sponsoring political parties, anything of that kind. And he did say, even when he ran for the president, that he would get all the oligarchs around the table and discuss that, how that could be done, that nothing will be touched, no assets will be taken away from them, but they need to consciously claim and live up to that claim that they will give up politics in Ukraine and they will just go into businesses and function as that. For a year or two maybe of Zelensky presidency, that's kind of subsided because I think he was trying to catch up with all the other developments in the country, not being a professional politician or statesman. It took him some time to wrap his head around everything. He was certainly struggling at the times, making some mistakes, which were widely criticized. But I think one thing he did get right was the law, the anti-oligarch law, that has now become quite legendary and quite effective, I must say, because when it was first introduced in the parliament in 2021, it was late 2021, I can't remember exactly, was it August or September? But he first introduced that law and the parliament voted for it, and he rushed to sign it just to make it active and for it to start functioning. And that law had several very concrete bullet points that set out exactly that any businessman who wants to function properly in the country, if he also owns any media holdings, he needs to sell them ASAP, and there were deadlines, that you can't own a media business and some other industrial businesses. You can't be proven to sponsor any political parties or have any level of political engagement. So it's either or, basically. Whatever he set out to do, it was all written out in that law. And there was a huge wave of dissatisfaction, of course, produced by the same oligarchs. Some of them went into defensive position, and you could tell that they were definitely not ready to give in to that. And I think we can see now that one of them was Igor Kolomoisky. Other ones actually started abiding by those rules and started slowly preparing to sell their assets in any media holdings that they had. And one of those oligarchs, which was quite prominent fact back then, I think it's happened last year, within the first 6 months, I think, even during the war, the richest man of Ukraine, Rinat Akhmetov, who now actually owns the company DTEC, who provides all the electricity to Ukraine and is struggling quite a lot. And the famous, or now sadly infamous, Azovstal in Mariupol is also part of his holding. He sold any shares in the media that he had, so he completely gave up his 2 TV channels. I think there was also a newspaper, so he got rid of all of that, just not to be deemed as oligarch. But as we could see, Igor Kolomoisky certainly didn't agree to that. His TV channel 1+1, which is one of the most famous and popular in Ukraine, that's still in affiliation with him. And I think he's made it quite clear that he has no intention to abide by those rules. I think it's quite significant, the fact that the oligarch who thought that, he maybe contributed to creating Zelensky as this leader of Ukraine, transforming him from a successful businessman, showman, producer. He wasn't just a comedian or an actor. He was also quite a smart producer and a businessman in his own right. A very successful one too. He's built a whole media empire in Ukraine and in post-Soviet space. They were, before he became a president, they were producing and filming creating like up to 10 movies a year that were very popular in post-Soviet space. So all of that being said, Kolomoisky thought that, maybe he has more leverage over him than he was allowed to have. And certainly I'm sure that Zelensky did not appreciate that he didn't feel like he was the president. He was not going to, abide by one oligarch's rules or his influence and power. And clearly that's where they've gone their two separate ways, which resulted into the criminal proceedings that we're seeing now.
And of course, the war itself and the extraordinary persona, which I think almost nobody expected of Zelensky as a wartime leader who has been compared to Churchill. I'm not sure anyone expected that. But of course, that stature, and I'm sure he's made mistakes, but he's also clearly made some very strong decisions as well. That has perhaps given him more power and influence than he perhaps would have had in previous civilian times.
Absolutely. I think he's a brilliant crisis manager. He's an amazing wartime leader. I think because he comes from business, when he is used to making executive decisions, even operating under the martial law has really helped him a lot. And then considering that he needed to be, the #1 communicator and transmitter of the message from Ukraine, giving his TV producer experience and being a writer and quite a creative person in general. And just, I do think that it sincerely comes from the bottom of his heart. He does love his country. He did see a lot of unfair actions done by previous presidents and politicians, and he sincerely thought and wanted to change that. And as soon as he felt that he's got the support of the people to try to be that, he just went for it. So I think we got really lucky with, that corroboration of so many factors that came together in him. And it just shows you the role of an individual in the history, that who knows how the things would have turned out for Ukraine now if it wasn't specifically for this one man with all of his characteristics in place in power.
And that's extraordinary, isn't it? Because you've got one individual who's making a difference. Nonetheless, it's been pointed out that whether there was Zelensky or not, the Ukrainian people would have fought. And even if Zelensky had been taken out in the first weeks and not survived, the fight would have gone on. I think that's a kind of interesting idea there.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas compare that to Russia, whereas one individual in Russia has, a Shakespearean, totally inappropriate influence on the history and direction of that country. But it's in another way. I mean, it's unbelievably negative that one individual can distort history so much as Putin has done.
One thing that you learn in political science is that the nation always deserves its leader, and the role of a leader of a nation almost represents like a litmus paper of the state of the society at the moment. It embodies all of the good and the bad things of the society that it governs at the moment in a specific period of time. And I think we are seeing exactly that. You see a brave, dedicated individual who was willing even to sacrifice himself, sacrifice a lot, sacrifice the time with his family for the country to finally, get it over the line after so many years of struggle that we've witnessed throughout our independence years. The two revolutions, the loss of lives, starting from the second revolution in 2014, when we first witnessed people getting killed on the main square in the country. Just imagine that people come out to protest on Trafalgar Square or in front of the parliament and they get shot by special forces. It was as unthinkable to us as it would be probably to people here in the UK or anywhere else in the world in a civilized country with a democracy and a rule of law. So I think he, having lived through all of those times with us, we finally came to a point where we got a person who was not willing to get engaged in the corruption, who was sick and tired of that, who saw that there's simply no way out for the country if we just don't change the approach, if we don't reform the government, if we don't put the right people into power without any Russian influence, without any post-Soviet mentality, because those things are completely interconnected. Whereas we're seeing the other thing, the opposite thing in Russia, sadly, where their society has not grown so much. I don't think they formed a civil society or that mentality of a nationhood. There certainly is that narrative of, the great Russia, and almost, as we can see in Putin now and many propagandists on TV, the chauvinism, the xenophobia, the fascism in its pure form, really. It's kind of went completely the wrong way, their civilizational development, unfortunately. And the fact that those two things, I think they went into pattern, the society and the political leadership, and it almost kept degrading each other. When the political leadership saw that society does not get engaged, it's not going to participate in any way, it's not going to speak out in any effective way. It takes to murder one opposition leader, Boris Nemtsov, who would have been actually a brilliant leader for Russia. I don't see any personality at the moment who could have come close to him.
No. I mean, Ilya Yashin is the only one. He has his flaws, but he's the only one who is unambiguous about condemning colonialism. He's, of course, in prison. And, of course, he was also a protege of Boris Nemtsov.
Yeah. So perhaps just that. There were some protests, but very fractional and very quick to get subsided, really. Of course, police brutality is there. Of course, people get beaten up, thrown into jail for protest. And when I hear from so many Russians these days saying, well, we wouldn't come onto the streets, or the opposition saying there's no way for people to go protest against this war because the police is just going to beat them up and throw into jail. Well, we know, we've gone through the same thing in Ukraine. We've been there. I personally still have bruises left over on my legs from the revolution of dignity from police, where it's, probably the blood vessels were forever damaged and there's just no recovery. But that's something that you have to go through. If you don't do it now, it's only going to deteriorate. And I think that's where Russians led it. They didn't have enough unity. They didn't have enough social cohesion. They didn't have enough belief in the fact that democracy is important, that it is important to defend their rights for freedom and freedom of speech, freedom to vote, and to run their country. And eventually, they gave up power, and the corrupt leadership was happy to take it all and to lead the country to where they needed to lead it just in order to keep their power, authority, and all the illicit funds that they've acquired over many years. So again, this is exactly what we're seeing. The political authority in the country is just a reflection of the society in Russia.
And to link those two sort of themes we've been talking about together, the oligarchization of society, that made Ukraine far more vulnerable, didn't it, to Russian narratives, to Russian plants or assets being placed to put the sort of Russian point of view. And in fact, for active measures, as they're called, to really sort of take effect. So defending Ukrainian society, making it more resilient, that goes hand in hand with the process of converting oligarchs into just business people, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And it's worth noting that I think almost every single oligarch in Ukraine had ties with Russia, and quite strong ones, because to begin with, the richest businessmen turned oligarchs, they were in oil and gas business. So inevitably there will be economic ties with Russia, buying and selling gas or oil from Russia and back and forth. They were in coal mining business, and eventually those coal mines in Donbass, for example, were partly owned by Russia, either state companies or private businesses. So there was constant interlocking between the businesses and massive supply chain dependencies between those. So inevitably that translated again into going to Russia, trying to make deals, trying to negotiate with various people, getting involved in politics of it, and Russians sponsoring or contributing to the funds of pro-Russian political parties too, to voice those narratives, to build up, the unity with the great Russian state, the Russian-speaking population, dividing Ukraine culturally, language-wise, just splitting the society into as many fractions as possible, going by the principle divide and conquer. We have seen that all throughout the 2000s in Ukraine, especially actively after the Orange Revolution, when they saw a strong pro-Western sentiment in the country, when they saw that Ukraine was actually talking, finally loud and clear, talking about the EU membership, they decided, okay, now it's time to act. So if we can't fully get rid of the pro-Western politicians, turn the whole country around, change the minds of those pro-Western oriented people of Ukraine, which were the majority, then we just need to split the country as much as we can, divide them mentally and culturally, so that they never come to an agreement and to a united decision. And that's been there ever since the beginning. And it's so important to watch. If any of the researchers or government officials now look at what's been done in Ukraine in the 2000s, they could see the exact same scenarios, the exact same tactics being applied in the West to sow division amongst the countries, amongst the allies, EU or NATO, and amongst the societies who now try to put up this united front against Russia and its tactics and its extremely toxic influence in the world. But they're trying to divide those societies from within. So it's very important to watch Ukrainian example to try to counter that.
This is the amazing thing, and this is why it's fantastic to speak to someone who's in politics, because I get the impression that now, with this huge external pressure, Ukrainians behave as if their internal differences are less important than the external threat. And that seems to be a fairly obvious thing to say. The person in the political party you're fighting against is not a bigger enemy to you than the person who's threatening you at the end of the barrel of a gun. It seems that for a while in the UK and certainly in the US, people had got into the mindset that actually their immediate opponent was a worse enemy than some external force. And that's a challenge that is still being played out in the US with the extreme division between the left and the right. I know that statement is going to generate a lot of comments from people on the left and right blaming each other for the division. But that's the whole point of the process, isn't it? It's designed to weaponize the social and political differences that people have and prevent them from working through those differences through dialogue and mutual understanding.
Yes, exactly. Escalating those tensions is, the number one objective here, because the more you escalate, the less productive things are happening. So society simply does not function. It gets frozen in time and it doesn't progress anywhere. It's not capable of making any tangible decisions, getting the country out of the crisis, still not just the war crisis related to energy supplies and everything else, but also the post-COVID crisis and cost of living and the inflation, etc. So the easiest thing to do to completely paralyze any societies to mobilize to get out of those crises is just set everyone against each other and watch them fight.
And I really want to do an episode at some point soon, because I spoke to Mark Galliotti back when I started the series, who's obviously an expert on, criminal behaviors and international, sort of mafia groups, as well as, of course, Russia, which, the comparisons aren't lost there as it acts very much like a cartel.
Where he might have built most of his experience. Yes, he's a brilliant expert on Russia.
But one of the areas which was only just starting to be explored, and of course, which still appears in Russian narratives and Vatnik narratives, is, of course, that somehow the protests in Donbass had organic origins. Now, we know there was some discontent against the revolution of dignity as you went further east, the less support there was for it. But the actual creation of the People's Republic, so-called, themselves, that is a very different process, isn't it? And I think you have to look at the effects of oligarchs, corruption, and as you say, you had to look at the ownership of things like industrial plants and assets, as well as the influx of criminal gangs and elements, in addition to the GRU. I don't think that history has yet been written properly, but it's an incredibly concerted attempt to leverage all of that oligarchical ownership and interest to create the insurgency.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that was exactly what Putin was counting on, even back in 2014, when they decided to seize those territories, because still even the Ukrainian separatists that were there, that created the, LNR, DNR, they were still influenced by Russia. They were infiltrated. They were put there way before the time that, the plan was set out to unfold itself. Those people were in close engagement with, Russian authorities for the longest time. They knew that there was a mission for them to do whenever time comes. So it still wasn't the Ukrainians that were disgruntled with the way that things are playing out in Ukraine. It was purely people who were agents of influence from the Russian state that were there with their own set out agenda for a very long time. The region was heavily influenced by Russia, yes, exactly by what you said, the heavy industry that had close ties with Russia itself, the political environment too. Of course, it builds on the fact that so many people there have relatives in Russia just across the border. They often travel back and forth. They mostly speak Russian, and that is fine. I would say most of Ukraine was bilingual. Even the region that I am from, Chernivtsi, in the west, southwest of Ukraine, on the border with the European Union between Romania and Moldova, many people spoke both Ukrainian and Russian. It wasn't anything that was unusual. I mean, our whole generation, our parents, grandparents, they grew up and lived in the Soviet Union where the state language was Russian. So of course, that was still part of everyone's routine. There was nothing significant about it. But going back to Donbass, that was always a region that was heavily influenced by Russia. And sadly, Ukraine overlooked the threats that were coming from Russia. And Ukraine tried to, not escalate. Again, something for the West to learn. And the only reason why we're now being so bold in telling the West the only escalation with Russia is being weak and showing that weakness and trying to always subside, because that's when they become aggressive and want to take more. Because we've learned it ourselves. We learned it the hard way. The border between Ukraine and Russia was not demarcated, and there was no delimitation of borders until I think late 90s. So that took such a long time, almost to showcase we're such good neighbors, we don't even need borders. You didn't need to have a foreign passport. So in Ukraine, we have an internal passport, which is almost like an ID, and you use that for all the bureaucratic procedures inside of the country. And then you have a foreign passport, the one that you travel abroad to. You didn't even need to have a foreign passport to go to Russia. You could go in with your ID, the internal document, to showcase that goodwill and neighborly relations. We didn't have a border. You could go visit your family quite easily. Many things were not, there were no boundaries between Ukraine and Russia. And one of the results of that is that the east of Ukraine, especially, was heavily infiltrated by Russian media. It was completely covered by Russian TV channels. Very often Ukrainian channels would get blocked. They simply would not have space left in the media environment. All of the newspapers, websites, media, everything was in Russian and was actually, Russian media entities functioning on that territory. So inevitably, they were getting quite a different sense of reality to the rest of Ukraine. So I'm sure that that's affected them greatly. But even that being said, if you were to hold a referendum in Donbass to create any sort of separatist republics, and if you have a fair vote, there is no way that those people will want to separate themselves and get away from, you know, a normal, successful country that was actually becoming civilized and economically prosperous by the day. And I could argue exactly the same point about Crimea. I know that there are many opinions, and I know that maybe today, with so many Russians having been relocated into Crimea and so many Ukrainians having fled the peninsula to the mainland Ukraine, and Crimean Tatars that were deported from there or fled themselves because they were getting persecuted, maybe now the results would have been different. But even in 2014, if you had a fair referendum in Crimea, I doubt that the people would vote to become part of Russia.
Not fully, yeah, not fully governed by. And you know, I mean, you could take an example of you know, large Russian-speaking populations, for instance, in Narva, in Estonia, and just ask them, you know, do you want to be united with Ivangorod and become part of the Russian Federation? And no matter what nationalist sentiment they might express, if you put it in those terms, the answer would be a resounding no. Yeah, no, thank you.
Yeah, I don't doubt it. You know, there could be many various feelings, maybe towards Russian culture, maybe the sense of being ethnically Russian and belonging to that community mentally, culturally. But even when it comes to the state policies, everyone wants to be in a successful, transparent, economically prosperous European state rather than in Russia.
Well, I know we're coming sort of towards the end, but one of the questions I wanted to ask as we sort of wrap up really harks back to something you mentioned earlier, which is that Zelensky is good in a crisis. But this is something that many of the Ukrainians I've spoken to have extrapolated out as almost like a national characteristic, that Ukrainians in peacetime can be, you know, fairly chaotic in some senses, you know, and if you have 3 Ukrainians in a room, they'll form 4 political parties. And yet they've said that Ukrainians in a crisis kind of come together in an extraordinary way. And I think many of the people I've spoken to have this characteristic, which I've been told lessens as you head further east. But it's that characteristic to see a problem and not assume that the state is going to solve that problem, but to try and then think of a way to solve that problem yourself. So a sort of self-organizing component.
I think Ukrainians have definitely formed a very strong civil society, and we've seen that starting at the revolution in 2004 and going into 2014, when it was completely society-led, and political parties, because I was one of the 3 political parties that were basically leaders of that movement. I had to, you know, basically follow the lead of the people and become part of their community, but also being a young person, I would be one of those drivers for change. But political parties were somewhere, you know, on the side, because it was purely human-led effort. You're right about Ukrainians in peaceful times kind of forming 4 political parties for three people. There's even an age-old saying in Ukrainian going back to Cossack times that says exactly that. I believe that it's not just Ukrainians, it's all human beings. And even going back to what you discussed about, for example, the situation in the United States of America now, when the 2 political sides are so antagonized against each other, it's because they don't really have that external threat as a nation, as one single unit, where they can cease to exist. Because now they can focus on their internal differences, and they have all the time on their hands to do that, since there's no other external risks that are really worth their attention. For Ukrainians, I think, sadly, maybe on one hand, quite luckily, but sadly, we do have that risk. And when we finally come to realize after the 90s and 2000s, and not really, you know, we always knew that Russia had its own interests in Ukraine, wanted to control it, still had those imperialist ambitions, but we thought, it will be just that. It will be just the aspiration. It will be the arrogance. It will be the, humiliation sometimes and undermining, but just in a form of control, almost like a toxic relationship. But we never thought that it would come for them wanting to kill us, to murder us, exterminate us, and really, unleash the full terror of genocidal war upon us. I think that's something that Ukrainians were quite shocked by and really surprised, and that embedded into our souls really this sense of unity, that, at the end of the day, we only have each other. We only have our president who's there in the office and who on the second day of war came out and said, the president is here. We're not going anywhere. The famous phrase of, I don't need a ride, I need ammunition. And that's what most Ukrainians, learned, took it on board and decided, okay, we're all together in this. Even if the leader of the nation, the political elites who normally go their own way, try to preserve themselves, try being quite selfish and self-centered. For the first time, Ukrainians saw the political elites are one with the nation. So that definitely consolidated this effort. And, we all went into this fight. When you have the lives of your loved ones on the line, when you see people and women and children dying every day, when you see children getting raped, when you see just the enormous terror that Russia is inflicting upon us, there's just no other thought in your head than just to unite against this one common enemy and give it your all. Because at this point in time, we understand that this is the decisive time for Ukraine. It will either fight Russia off or it will cease to exist.
That's it, I think, and that's probably a good place to conclude on. But I'm not going to ask, what's going to happen, because I think no one knows, and yet Ukrainian victory is looking more likely, but is by no means the complete victory that is required by pushing Russia out of every inch of Ukrainian territory. That is by no means certain, but it is likely that Ukraine can no longer be overrun, which is good, and Kiev is safe, and the eastern provinces are, as far as they can be, safe. But this war, firstly, needs to end cleanly, and Russia needs to be shown, of course, decisive force, as you said earlier, as the bully that only respects force and doesn't respect weakness. That's the only way that a lasting peace can be achieved. But at the same time, my last question is going to be, what will be the role now of Ukraine in Europe and potentially NATO? Because it seems to me that the shift of decision-making and power in Europe has shifted decisively east, and Ukraine will now be a pivotal element in a future militarized Europe, within the engineering and the tech sector, but also an incredible force within culture and a resurgence, hopefully, of civil society.
Ukraine's victory is inevitable. I think that's an established fact now. You can never have any guarantees in this world, but I think the way the history is going, Ukraine's victory is the only sensible, logical way where civilization might go next. If Ukraine, by any chance, we play as a scenario where Ukraine loses, the whole world starts falling apart, really. There is no more international rules-based order. The European Union might cease to exist itself. NATO becomes completely irrelevant because no members feel safe or like there's even a point in such an alliance. It will completely change the structure of the world if Ukraine loses. It's no longer just about Russia's war in Ukraine. And I think it's really fair to say, actually, no one really wants to say that, just not to get NATO involved. And everyone's talking about preventing the World War III. But inevitably, we are witnessing the World War III. It's just not the wars like we previously experienced. It's not the first or the second one. It's not fully physical war. We need to get used to hybrid warfares in the future as well, where, we don't see any NATO soldiers on the ground in Ukraine, but we see the intelligence support, we see the provision of military, humanitarian aid, financial aid. We see the whole world chipping into this war, just not providing the people, basically. So inevitably, this is the war of civilizations, maybe to quote Huntington. It is just that. Ukraine will inevitably win. Unfortunately, at this point, it is the matter of the number of lives that we will lose, the cost at which this victory comes. And, you know, it's been an extremely difficult year. It was not an easy 8 years before that, from 2014. Before the full-scale war happened, we had 15,000 casualties in Ukraine in this war. Now the numbers are not being announced, but I fear that they go into 100,000s with civilians and soldiers and all the casualties in the world. And, you know, who knows what this year will bring. And I fear that it could be even bloodier, with Ukraine winning the war and Russia desperately trying to, you know, hold their grounds as much as they can and just not sparing any lives, Ukrainian or Russian ones.
I mean, that's right. I mean, Russia has contempt, not just for other people, but it has contempt for its own citizens. It has no value placed on their lives whatsoever. So it's difficult to know whether they have any limits in terms of the carnage or wastage they would cause. I think one of the upsides has to be that Russia probably would embrace World War III if it thought it could get other countries involved. And fortunately, there's been a huge reluctance on the part of almost anybody else in the world to take Russia's side, and even China are keeping them at arm's distance and don't want to be associated with the military operation, even though they're clearly supporting them on the economic side. This whole episode is potentially, as you say, deciding the direction, civilizational direction, but it also risks ending Russia's civilizational journey as well. I mean, it seems to me that with the constant stream of lies, deception, the flagrant breaking of every single international law and convention, Russia has experienced a civilizational decline, which has no comparison, except perhaps with, you know, the descent into barbarism of the Germans in the late 1930s.
Yes, I think by some estimates last year, the experts were saying that Russia has gone back 30 years in time. I think by the end of this war, we might be seeing even greater change. And I think it's falling back centuries, not just in terms of technology or economics, financial sphere. It's becoming extremely decoupled from the West. It already is. But just mentally and culturally, I think this narrative of aggression towards the West will still only grow until it will reach its kind of pinnacle. And then with the change of authorities, they will perhaps, hopefully, start even re-educating the whole society. But certainly Russia has gone back in time, and it is really, really sad that such a vast country in the world, with maybe not so much population, but still a decisive chunk of world's population, is going so rapidly and quickly back in time, which we all thought was quite close to, you know, normal Western values. So that region is going to be very different in the future as well. And going back to your previous question about, you know, reconfiguring Europe, I think all the countries around Russia will also try to, you know, redefine themselves and find their own space in this political new formation of the world. The countries that heavily depended on Russia, all the post-Soviet states, will now and are already now starting to desperately seek alliances in the West. We could see that with all the Central Asian countries. We see that with Caucasus, even though, you know, the situation is unclear. With Georgia, for example, who's still occupied by Russia and has really strong Russian influence. I think as Russia grows weaker, even Georgia will start rising from the knees and starting to being a bit more proactive. We could see that from the Central Asian countries. We already see that from the countries like Azerbaijan, for example, who's actively building ties with the West through energy supply and are offering their extent there, just to build that economic channel going. We see Central Asian countries who are looking towards China and seeking support there as opposed to Russia. So the tendencies in the region are changing, but the Western world itself is changing quite a lot too. Because if you remember, before the full-scale war happened, everyone was debating the relevance of NATO, why it still needs, is the organization dead? Is there any purpose to it? Same went for the UN. There were discussions about how almost purposeless and useless, in fact, it is. And the EU was obviously having a major crisis after Brexit, after some conflicts with Poland. And there were questions that were being asked on a daily basis. Is there a future for the EU? As well as NATO? A famous phrase by Macron when he said that NATO is brain dead. It's certainly been resuscitated throughout the last year. All of these organizations found their new purpose. But what's interesting is that the dynamics within that purpose, within those organizations, both NATO and the EU, are changing and shifting drastically. When you look at NATO, for example, you definitely see the more proactive stance of the eastern flank and the northern flank. You can see the countries like the UK, who tries to carve out this role of global Britain in today's world, how it's formed the JEF, for example, alliance, the Joint Expeditionary Force, with 10 other NATO and non-NATO countries in the north of Europe, the strong military ties with the Baltics, the trilateral agreement, UK, Poland, Ukraine, which is very interesting because you have Poland, who US's strongest military ally, and Ukraine, who's playing now a pivotal role in the security in the region. And you have a NATO member, Turkey, who's very often being overlooked by Western partners, but now is a crucial country to, A, maintain, secure that dialogue with Russia, and B, provide the security in the Black Sea region and all the other allies in the region. So the dynamics are changing, and similarly in the EU as well, with Hungary playing their own game, Poland having really strong ties with the US and overtaking the initiative. And I think being so economically successful, we might see Poland actually be one of those countries in the future who would informally lead the European Union.
Oh, that's fascinating to see those emerging. I mean, obviously, in the short term, we can only hope that Ukrainian victory comes at a lower price. I mean, the price is already far too high and is incredibly painful. But all we can do is hope that victory is decisive and that the West doesn't lose its nerve in terms of supporting Ukraine and providing what's needed. I know we're out of time. I wanted to thank you tremendously, Aliona, for spending so much time in talking through some of these issues that have been sort of going through my mind for an extraordinarily long time and providing clarity around this. I know the audience is going to love this video. But yeah, all I want to say is thank you and Slava Ukraini.
Heroyam Slava. It's very heartwarming to hear that. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for having Ukrainian voices on and raising the issue of Ukraine and keeping it high on the agenda and just wanting to learn more about our country and our people. So thank you for that.